Hey, how's everyone doing today? So, what I'm going to be talking about is what it means to be a hockey player. I'm going to be talking about the being of a hockey player, what it means to inhabit the mode of being that goes into the experience of playing this sport of hockey. Now, we could ask this question about any sport, but I want to focus on hockey because I think hockey makes this, at least it's the most simple to make explicit in its experience. Other sports, you have this as well, or really anything in life. There's lots of ways to inhabit different modes of being, but I think hockey is a good microcosm that can demonstrate this in a very explicit sense. So, what do I mean by this? I mean, you can be part of, say, like a nation or a cultural heritage and inhabit that particular mode of being, all the things associated with it. And this can get complicated to define in those grand scales. But when we look at being a hockey player, for example, and what that experience entails, all the little details, we can sort of bring out what kinds of things go into inhabiting a mode of being. And so it's simple to just think about things in their objective qualities, right? What has to happen for you to play the sport? So you can talk about the rules, you can talk about the skills, all these different things. But when it comes to what it means to actually transform into that being so that you can achieve that experience, that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So when we look at hockey, for example, what do you transform into? What do you have to inhabit? What type of experience do you have to inhabit so that you can be that hockey player? And so the first thing, I think that's the most obvious, but for for a hockey player, this probably isn't very obvious, is your skates. Now, when you're wearing skates, you have to move about your world in a completely different manner, one that's alien to human locomotion, right? We're built to move very linearly. Our legs go front to back. We run through long strides in that straight line. But when we take skating, for example, we're pushing off at these 45-degree angles and having blades extending our height and having to balance ourselves on two tiny little edges, right? Each blade has tiny edges that we're balancing on. We're using these to navigate our playing field. And we are not just using the ground force reaction to propel ourselves like we do when we run, but we're actually gliding as we're driving our legs forward to move about the ice. So all of this is just sort of inherent to the experience of playing hockey. And when one does this, this is a kind of a thing. Your skates are ready to hand in this Heideggerian sense, right? They're a tool that you're using, but you're not really aware that you're using them as a tool in the moment. They're invisible to you at the time. And what's happening here is you have this sort of extension into those tools. And when we talk about extension in a sort of metaphysical sense, the simplest way to talk about extension is occupying space. So, for example, you could talk about color being extended into the object that it inhabits. It occupies the space of that object as the color. And you can't have color just on its own, floating, atomized outside of some object. Color's always extended into something. And when we talk about extension into objects, as this phenomenon of your internal mental projections or mental experiences projecting out into the external world, then we can talk about that mental projection occupying space in the external world in terms of what kind of instruments you're using. So when we talk about extension in the sense of hockey, you extend yourself into your skates. Those skates become an extension of you. You are now occupying skates as another aspect, like an appendage to yourself. And so this changes the entire world that you inhabit as you're moving about the ice. And An interesting thing, we can compare, for example, the way that a hockey player extends themselves in their skates. And again, when I say extend themselves, I don't mean they're consciously forcing their mental insides into the skates, because this all happens, again, like you said, it's ready to hand. It's this invisible experience. You're using this tool without really thinking about it. Of course, you need to put time into developing the skill to use that tool, but as you're in the mode of being, you're not really thinking about it. So it's not as if you're forcing yourself to extend into the skates. You just are them. They just are a part of you, like an extra limb or an extension to your limbs. But we can talk about different ways that you're extended into your skates if we compare like a hockey player or a figure skater or a speed skater. Even though all these tools are similar in terms of the area that they allow you to inhabit and move about on the ice, they all offer different modes of being despite being very similar. Right? A hockey player is using the skates to navigate the ice surface for the purpose of playing a game of hockey. So there's a whole bunch of extra steps, a whole bunch of extra rules and practices to follow on top of the skating, whereas a figure skater is focused on the skates themselves and what they allow them to do. All of the different figure skating tricks and dances. It's all about the movement itself and what that extension enables the figure skater to perform. And then when you have a speed skater, they're purely a tool for the speed itself. It's more analogous to a runner. So just because you're extended into an object doesn't mean that that extension happens in the same way just because it's the same object. And then so we'll talk more about the experience of a hockey player. Now, a hockey player, in that extension, they're not, like I said, they're not really thinking about what's going on in terms of the skates being another part of themselves. It just, they just inhabit the skates. And there's not much thought that goes into inhabiting the skates here, because as that player moves about the ice, that they're just in that world, that hockey game. It's just a world that they live in the same way that you move about your world walking, and you don't really think about the process of walking. That hockey player, despite having a completely different tool and style of movement, the hockey player just is that thing. It just is a hockey player. They are a hockey player. And then when we add on the other factors, the other instruments into the hockey player, there's different layers to this now. So you add the stick, well, you have to be extended into that stick as well in the same way that you're extended into your skates. The stick is a whole other area of movement that you have to be aware of and you have to be participating in. Because it's not just about where the skates take you and what the ice surface offers you. It's also about where the puck is and where you can control that puck and what you can do to influence the other player's control of the puck as well. So then the length of the stick is part of you now. And what that stick can offer you in terms of its use for the game is now a part of your whole mental projection. You're in the world that the stick and the skates allows you to be in. And you could even say this is the same for all the gear that you wear. Because when you're in full hockey gear, it's a lot different than even just being in no hockey gear. When you just, maybe you're playing a scrimmage at the outdoor rink and you have no gear on, it's just a casual pickup game. You are still inhabiting a slightly different world than when you're in the full gear, because when you're in full gear, there's now another whole avenue of playing available to you. There's contact and there's more risks to be taken. There's diving in front of the puck. So again, what is afforded to you, and we can talk about affordances as what your environment and your own skills and the instruments that you're using, what it is afforded to you is what's allowed and what's all subsumed within the field and the environment and the instruments, what those allow you to do, what you're able to perform, your affordances there. So now with the gear, you're afforded more avenues of movement and playing. So with all of this compiled upon each other, you have an entirely different world to live in on the ice than you do off the ice. Even though you're the same person, in a sense, you're not really the same person because you're being a hockey player as opposed to being that guy that's just walking down the street. So there's a lot of implications here. So for example, you're not just someone who picks up a stick and uses it for a game, right? You're not just a guy who has a couple of skills on the ice. You are a hockey player, right? You have to inhabit an entirely different world to be that. And so when someone looks from the outside in to a hockey player, for example, they can't really know what that is. If you've ever put on skates before, you can never know what skating is. It doesn't matter how many books you read, doesn't matter how much you research the biomechanics of skating. You don't really know what that is unless you live it, unless you are it. And so we can see this applied into that cultural setting as well, right? You can't just simply be another people, another nation, if you don't inhabit that world they live in yourself. And going back to the hockey example, it's not just as simple as sort of mimicking it either. Because even if you can skate, and I can tell you this from experience, even if you skate, the second that your stick goes out of your hand and you're just skating without a stick, you aren't the same anymore. It doesn't matter how good your skating skills are. You can do the exact same skills without a stick, and it feels completely off. It feels like you just aren't the same. And this would be even true if you hold a stick that isn't actually a hockey stick. If you held some walking cane instead, it's not as simple as just replacing things with similar weight or similar size or similar shape. You couldn't put on a pair of blades that was again, we go back to the figure skating or the speed skating example. You couldn't put on a pair of figure skates and suddenly feel like a hockey player. You pick up your stick and then go play a game of hockey. It's not that, there's a very specific way that you inhabit this world, and any sort of cheap imitations or substitutes here and there, or even just a loss of one of the instruments that you extend yourself into, leads to a whole different world that you inhabit. Even though it doesn't seem that obvious from the onset, it would, again, when you go back to example of equipment versus non-equipment. If I don't wear my equipment, I know there are different things afforded to me, and there's just simply a different feeling about the whole thing. How my movements flow is different in equipment than without equipment. And so when we talk about the worlds of being that you follow in, and the modes of being that you can inhabit, we have to be careful not to assume that you can just inhabit anything by picking it up on the spot, or by substituting things in and out, or by reading about them and assuming that we know what that is like. Because there's a lot of layers that go into this whole experience. And again, I think hockey is a clear example of this. And sports in general, again, you go on the basketball court and there's very specific rules and there's boundaries that you follow, and there's different ways to move about the court that are afforded to you. And you can't simply just understand that from the outside looking in. You have to be in it. And I think hockey's the clearest example of this because of that nature of the completely foreign elements of it. the way that you move differently, the nature of the puck control, and the way the puck moves about the ice, and the way the flow of the game operates. All these things turn hockey into a very, very unique, almost abstract experience. It's so far removed from day-to-day motion that we can clearly see it as something different to us. But we can apply these same principles into other areas of our lives so that we have a better understanding of what it means to be something, to inhabit a mode of being. And I think that's all I got on this topic for today. So, thanks for watching. See you around.